The protest will test the economic IQ of every central banker in the universe, because they will be the first to admit that they are as confused as you are. So we have to make sense out of this madness. So I'm going to divide my brief presentation into three parts. The first part will be about inflation. The second part will be about inflation. And the third part will be, you got it, about inflation. And after talking about inflation for 20 minutes, I'm going to tell you this is not about inflation. This is about the cost of bringing inflation down to 2%. The Bank of Canada, the ECB in Europe, the Fed in the US, they have all established their reputation as inflation fighters. They're going to do whatever it takes to bring that inflation back to 2%, which is their target. And we can argue until we are blue in the face to what extent this 2% is the right number. It doesn't make any difference because the Bank of Canada is not going to change it. You need like 500 PhD dissertations to change their mind. I believe the 2% belong to the past. The number is higher, but we stuck with that. So we have to realize that this is going to be a major factor impacting future interest rates. This 2% target, we will talk about it in a second. Because of that, the Bank of Canada is biased. You wake up the Bank of Canada in the middle of the night and you tell them, inflation or a recession, they will take a recession any day. And because of that, they are overshooting. Let me remind you that every economic recession over the past 40 years was helped, if not caused, by a monetary policy error in which central bankers raised interest rates way too much and killed the economy. Why is that? Because inflation is a lagging indicator. Inflation is telling you about the past, not the future, not even the present. Inflation is telling you about the past. Inflation is like this brown spot of the banana. By the time you see it, it's way too late. So the point that I'm making here is that the Bank of Canada is already overshooting. If the Bank of Canada was an AI machine, they would have stopped 50 basis points ago. So we are overshooting already because of the fact that the Bank of Canada is biased. So now we are waiting for the Bank of Canada to start cutting interest rates, and we will see them cutting. We'll discuss when and how in a few minutes. But before that, I would like to discuss this. This is the CPI. So when I tell you inflation, what do you have in mind? What do you have in mind? CPI. Many people say food prices. So let me tell you something about food prices. We all go to the supermarket. We are all overwhelmed by how expensive food is. We all know that. The Bank of Canada does not care. Not because of the fact that they are not nice guys, they are very nice guys. But because of the fact that it's irrelevant. Inflation is a rate of change. Inflation is not the level of prices. So if food prices went up last year by 10%, and today they're rising by 5%, still rising by 5%, that's disinflationary as far as the Bank of Canada is concerned. And therefore, it's actually disinflationary. It doesn't impact them. In fact, it's a good news story. Despite the fact that the level of prices is very high. So that's something to remember. Another factor is supply chain. Supply chain is back to normal, which is a major anti-inflationary force. For a few reasons. First of all, prices of goods are down, makes sense. The other is that the effectiveness of monetary policy. You see, if supply chain is an issue, all the inflation is coming from supply, from outside the country. So the Bank of Canada is impotent in its ability to deal with the situation because everything is coming from outside the country. Believe me, Putin does not care about the fact that the Bank of Canada is raising interest rates. Now it's back to normal supply chain. All the inflation is coming from domestic sources, making the Bank of Canada more powerful because it's more sensitive to higher interest rates. And then you have retail profit margins. Let's face it. During COVID, many retailers were hiding behind the fog of supply chain. You went to the store You ask for this dishwasher, and they said, you know, supply chain, China, Russia. But if you had a little bit more money, we'll find one for you in the basement. That's exactly what happened. The correlation between supply chain and profit margins was 97%. Now, supply chain is back to normal, nowhere to hide anymore. Profit margins are basically zero, which means that this is a major, underrated disinflationary force. But what is inflation? Well, of course, it's CPI. So in the 1990s, it was very clear. The Bank of Canada focused on the CPI, and that was it. 2% CPI, Consumer Price Index. And then they said, you know what? We have energy prices and food prices that are very, very volatile. I don't want to start raising interest rates because OPEC is not in a good mood or Putin is not in a good mood. So let's look at core CPI, which is inflation minus energy and food. Fine. So you have two components. And then, a few years ago, they came up with another component, which is CPI-X, which is CPI minus 8 components. Fine. A few years ago, 2016, I guess they were not very busy at the Bank of Canada. They had some time. So they said, let's do more CPIs. CPI trim, CPI medium, CPI services, etc. All of a sudden, you have 6 CPIs. Now, how do you measure it? Now, this is important. Year over year, we all know that, year over year. And then they said, no, listen, year over year is too volatile. Jumps. Let's do 3 months moving average year over year. Fine. 2. Then they say, year over year. Who cares what happened a year ago? Let's do month over month. And then, of course, month over month, it's too volatile. So month over month, 3 months moving average, still volatile, 6 months moving average. All of a sudden, you have a matrix of 6 by 5 CPIs. 30 CPIs. So whenever they release the number, we have to deal with 30 numbers. This is an inflationary buffet. And why is it important? Why is it important? Because, and this is crucial, because the narrative determines the data, and not the data determines the narrative. You see, if the Bank of Canada is not in a good mood, and they say, you know what, I don't want to cut interest rates. You look at big numbers, and there are some big numbers here. So you point to them. If you are in a good mood, you say, you know what, let's start cutting interest rates, give them a break. You look at the zeros and the ones and the two. What I'm telling you is there is enough here for everybody. So I'm not looking at the numbers anymore. Because you can find whatever numbers you want, there are enough of them. I'm listening to the narrative. And the narrative determines the data. And then we have another crazy thing happening with inflation. Look at this. In inflation, there is something called housing inflation or shelter inflation, which is 1/3 of inflation. 1/3 is housing inflation. How do we measure it? It's not the price of houses. Not there. It's a commissions of real estate for real estate agents and brokers, commissions, fine. It's a rent that is rising by 8%, unfortunately, fine. But the biggest part of it is what? Mortgage interest payments that are rising by 30% a year. So think about it for a second. The Bank of Canada is raising interest rates to fight inflation. Higher interest rates are adding to inflation vis-a-vis higher mortgage interest payments. You see how crazy it is? This does not make any sense. It's like putting a humidifier and a dehumidifier in the same room and let them go at each other. Nobody will be able to convince me that higher mortgage interest payments are inflationary. They are disinflationary. And guess what happens when you remove mortgage interest payments from the calculation? Guess where inflation is? 1.5%. Already below the target. And that's why we are overshooting. And by the way, with the exception of Iceland, a major economic superpower, Canada is the only country in the universe that is using this as part of their calculation. If we use the US methodology, our inflation will be below 2% for sure. So we are saying that we are fighting something that does not exist. We created it. And this is a major issue because we all pay higher mortgage rates. And therefore, I believe that they should cut, and they should cut now. Now, by now, I'm sure that many of you are very disappointed. Because after all, everybody promised you a recession. And we didn't get a recession. Where is this recession? Well, let me tell you something. We are in a recession. We are in a per capita recession. Per capita GDP is down by 3.5%, consumption down by 2%. Per capita, our recession today is very close to the recession we have seen in 2008 and 1991. Per capita, we are in a recession. So the only reason why the economy is still above water, barely, is because of the fact that we got 1.2 million people into this country last year. Look at this. This is the hockey stick. 1.2 million people in 1 year, and this is another estimate. We have Henry Lawton here, an expert on demographics, and he will tell you that we are undercounting all those people. So whatever you see, those are the official numbers, and the real numbers is larger than that. This is not a way to grow an economy. India also has a lot of people. We need to see GDP per capita rising. That's extremely important to understand, and we have to do something about it. Oh my gosh, I have 7 minutes left. I'm just warming up. We'll see what happens. Let's just ignore it. We need to find a way to grow GDP per capita, and we'll discuss it in 2 minutes, because I think it's important. But clearly, the economy is in a recessionary territory. If you look at credit growth, basically zero. The only time it was zero, it was 1982, the double dip recession. The housing market was in a recession. It was a buyer's market with no buyers. But this market is waking up. The low-rise segment of the market is clearly in demand now, especially 5 million over and less than 2 million. The condo space, the resale market is clearly waking up, and the only issue is the pre-sale market, the pre-construction market that is dead. So we are not really building. 2 years from now, guess what will happen? The demand will be there. The supply that's supposed to come now will not be there. You don't have to be an economist to predict what will happen. So we have to clear the pre-sale market. That will happen over the next 6 to 12 months. But over the next 2 to 3 years, the demand will be there. The supply will not be there. You don't have to be an economist to predict. The best time to buy a condo, in my opinion, is over the next year, before this mismatch will be very evident. We know, and that's good news, 50% of mortgage holders already renewed their mortgages with high interest rates. That's good news. The bad news, 50% still have to renew. And the average price, the average increase in spending will be 20%. And this 20% includes some people that will pay less because they renewed last year for 1 year and now they're paying less. So for many people it will be 30-40%. And that's why clearly we need to see interest rates going down. Delinquency rates are starting to rise, and that's something that we have to worry about. It's not a major issue. If I told you that interest rates will go up by 500 basis points over the course of breakfast, and delinquency rates will still be below 2019 level, I will tell you are crazy. But that's exactly what's happening, and that's because of the very strong labor market that we'll discuss in 1 minute. I want you to look at this. We often blame cities for slowing down the process, and for a good reason. But the housing crisis, in many ways, is a planning crisis. It takes 10 years to get the land, to service it, to auction it, to sell it. You know the story. It takes 10 years. So municipalities need time. So in 2013, Stats Canada went to municipalities and said, population growth will be X. So all those municipalities prepared for X. The actual number in 2023 was X plus 1.4 million people. And that's an underestimate. 1.4 million people showed up. The vast majority of this miss was non-permanent residents. Many of them are students, and we are undercounting the number. I wish I had more time to go over it. The work which I did again with Realty shows that we are undercounting them by a lot. So whatever the situation is, it's worse. But let's stick with that. The vast majority, non-permanent residents, many of them are students, foreign students. So 20 to 25% of those so-called foreign students are not really students. They are here to buy citizenship on the cheap. And then there are a lot of so-called Mickey Mouse colleges that take advantage of the situation. Northern Ontario Advanced Mathematics Academia. Give me a break. $40,000 and you're in. This is not the way to do it. This is not the way to do it. We need foreign students. We need new immigrants. But that's not the way to do it. We have to make sure that we put a quota on them. I was very vocal with the government and saying we need to have a situation in which there are quotas. Because if we bring foreign students into this country, we have to be able to house them. 20% of them are in food banks. That's not a way to develop an immigration system. Canada needs new immigrants, but we have to do it smartly. And the quotas is very significant. The latest reduction from 6.5 to 5% will bring population growth down to about 1%, which is the long-term average. Probably too optimistic, it will be probably more than that, but let's stick with that. You have to reduce demand in order to start dealing with this affordability crisis, and it's a crisis. It is a crisis. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to present to the cabinet, the Canadian cabinet, government, and about many things, including affordability. And I told them, listen, if you guys don't deal with it urgently, because it is a crisis, we are going to have pockets of civil unrest. We are going to have anti-immigrant sentiment. We are going to have renters' strike. We have to wake up here. This is huge. Our kids, young people, cannot even dream about owning a house in this city. We have to wake up. First, reduce the demand. And second, start building more faster. And I wish we had more time to discuss it because there are many opportunities to do so. So, what's next? You are the Bank of Canada. You have to deal with the situation. What are you doing? Well, you have to look at the labor market. Because the labor market is where all the answers are. Because wage inflation can lead to service inflation. So what can we say about the labor market? Well, every first Friday of the month, we get at 8:30 in the morning the employment numbers from South Canada. 8:30 in the morning, first Friday of the month. So at 8:29 in the morning, every economist is sitting in front of his computer, looking, waiting, anticipating the numbers. Believe me, it's very exciting. And every time we look at those vacancy rates, remember 1 million vacancies that you cannot find work or help? And back then I didn't believe that number. I think that it was a mirage. But we're starting to see those vacancy rates going back to 2019 level. The quits rate is going down, which means that the bargaining power of labor is going down. We are seeing something very interesting. The number of people switching from one occupation to another went up to the sky during COVID. Let me demonstrate by using an example. Let's assume in a normal recession, not like this recession, a normal recession, you were an employee, let's say for Air Canada. You lost your job, you went on employment insurance for 6 months, and after 6 months, you went back to Air Canada or any other airline. Today, after 4 years, you moved on. You are in a totally different occupation, totally different industry. The rate at which people move from one industry to another went to the sky during COVID. So if you were Air Canada, you have to start fresh, start hiring new people. And it seems that they were able to do it. How do I know that? This morning I was in Montreal, took a flight back from Montreal to Toronto. Air Canada. All the flight attendants were new, were green. How do I know that? They were extremely extremely nice.
That's so true. You're the worst.
So the market is normalizing. The bargaining power of labor is slowing down. So we are in a situation in which the Bank of Canada has to make a decision. Usually, the gap between the Fed and the Bank of Canada is 75 basis points. Today, the gap is 25 basis points. So it's either the Fed is undershooting or the Bank of Canada is overshooting, and I don't think that the Fed is undershooting. And therefore, I think that we have to start cutting interest rates. So when? June or July? Now it seems more and more July. Why? Because the US is doing better. They are not going to cut anytime soon, and the Bank of Canada would like to minimize the amount of time they divorce themselves from the Fed. So what's happening in the US is starting to impact us. So June, July, whatever. By how much? We started this saga at 175. We are at 5. We are starting to cut, I hope, June, July, to what? I say about 3. So basically 100, 125 basis points higher than it was before. Why? Because we have 4 inflationary forces in the background. We used to have globalization. Now we have deglobalization, that's inflationary. We used to have just-in-time inventories. Now we have just-in-case inventories. That's inflationary. We used to have a labor market that was giving. Now it's a labor market that is tight. That's inflationary. And let's face it, many of those green initiatives, they are inflationary. So all those forces are inflationary. The target is 2%, hasn't changed. Same target, more inflation. Clearly, interest rates have to be higher. And let me remind you that this industry, the real estate industry, that is extremely positive, strong, and fundamentally sound, can do extremely well at a 3% overnight rate, the Bank of Canada rate. Extremely well. Because if something was underpriced, mispriced, over the past 30 years, it was cash. Interest rates were way too low. So 3% overnight rate is actually very healthy for you and for the industry and for the economy as a whole. So those forces are changing the way we look at interest rates, inflation, and the economy as a whole, and therefore the housing market. This housing market will do fine in the spring, will do much better in the fall, and much better in 2025 when interest rates are down. The fundamentals are extremely strong. And the way I look at the situation is to try to understand what happened. So very quickly, what happened during COVID? When prices went up by 40% like that. It's the asymmetrical nature of the crisis. All the jobs that were lost were low-paying jobs, young people, renters, and that's why rent during COVID went down. Home buyers, they were zooming. So their income was coming, interest rates were in the basement. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There was a sense of urgency to get into the market. And parents told their kids, you do that, we will help you. Gifting reached a record high during COVID. And if there is a sense of urgency to get into the market, you front-load activity. You borrow activity from the future. And the future has arrived. This is not a crash, this is not a correction, this is reallocation of activity over time. This is a very healthy market that slowed down in a very healthy way, and now it's starting to recover. The new reality is different. Keep asking yourself the following question: to what extent COVID was an event or a condition? I believe, economically speaking, COVID was a condition. It changed so many things and accelerated so many trends. This is a different environment. After this crisis, after this recession, after COVID, clearly what was normal in the past is not normal in the context of today's economy. Okay? Thank you very much, and good luck.